right, welcome to the Living Streams Church podcast. We are here. I guess I'm here at the church. Anthony's in New York. Brandon's in Idaho. We're all spread out, but I'm here in the dead of heat in the Phoenix, Arizona desert. But having a good time this summer because of the topic. I've really been enjoying the topic of this podcast and our sermon series, being human. And really what we're trying to do is get ourselves rooted in a biblical anthropology, really figuring out what the Bible teaches it means to be human so that we can promote human flourishing in this new age that we're entering into, the artificial intelligence, or just the intelligence age. I mean, whether it's artificial or not, it's still intelligence. And we want to make sure that we can promote human flourishing, whether there becomes some disorienting or even some deception that comes our way in this age. But also we're living in a political era where there's a lot of dehumanization, and we want to be able to stand against that as well. And also see how maybe the internet or the artificial intelligence is influencing politics and those type of things. So we want to be wise to all of that as well. And it's been a lot of fun. And I want to introduce the humans of the Being Human podcast today. Anthony. Anthony, how are you doing?
Doing well.
Yeah.
Glad to be back.
How's New York?
It's getting warm. Not Phoenix hot, but it's muggy. It's a humid warm.
Are you experiencing any of the FIFA World Cup craze over there, or not much?
We are. I was down in DC when we were on break for the podcast, and they have a whole like FIFA zone set up, and there was wow. I don't know, hundreds to maybe 1,000 people or so watching the games, and so it felt cool to kind of feel the energy as well. And it's starting to get good.
And in Boston, there's not an actual, there's no games there. It's the New York, New Jersey, right? Is that?
I think so. New York, New Jersey. Yeah.
That's cool. But still, people are so into it. And it's fun to just see the mobs of different, like the Netherlands or from Norway, they're rowing their boats up the escalators, and different things like that, which is so funny. I actually saw the Mexico fans were all rowing. They're pretending like they were rowing their boats down something. So it's been a lot of fun. And then also we have Brandon Gurney, who's a longtime friend of mine, and also someone I think it'll be really fun to hear from today about this space. So Brandon, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, David. I'm enjoying a cool morning here in Boise, Idaho, which is strange for me, having spent 10 years with you guys in Phoenix. But I'm taking advantage of the opportunity to bust out the fleece, and I see a 90 coming up in the forecast. So I'm going to just enjoy this as long as I possibly can. And we're not feeling the as much of the World Cup hype here up in Idaho. It's America 250 for sure is the name of the game up here, and I've been to my third rodeo as of this weekend.
Let's go.
Been to zero prior to this, and my son is he's obsessed with all things horses and cows and all that fun stuff. So we are in the right place for this season of life with him.
On that note, Anthony, I know you've been working on some 250 celebration stuff for America. Tell everybody just a little bit about that real quick.
Yeah, no, I'm. It's weird. I feel like I've given my background now fully on record, but as a marketer, this is really cool. I've had a chance to work with kind of the events team who's putting on some of the events that are happening at the national level. And so the big one, of course, this week is the 4th that's coming up. So there's like a big fireworks show in Washington, D.C. that's supposedly like 10x the volume of fireworks that have ever been blasted at the same time.
I love fireworks.
10 times that are happening. So involved with that and a few other things between now and the end of the year. But yeah, feeling the 250th as well, and kind of a special summer between FIFA, between the 250th and everything else going on.
Yeah, it's a big deal for America this year. And Freedom 250 is the thing that you've been working on with the Trump team, or the kind of Trump Association or whatever.
Yeah, the White House Task Force.
The White House Task Force. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. You've been interacting with a lot of interesting business leaders too because of that, which is pretty fun. And so the other thing that this podcast is really trying to do is it's trying to meet as many people as we can, or as the Lord brings together at that intersection of work and tech and faith. And we all have our own little stories of how we as men have developed a work life, a career life, and tech has always been a part of that. But at this point, tech is really kind of it's creating a lot of uncertainty in a lot of fields, including all the ones that we're in, but also creating a lot of opportunity in all of these fields. And so we're wanting to just kind of like do what we can to get whatever wisdom for our work life as we continue down this path. And I know Anthony always talks about the billion knowledge workers out there who are either already crashed at this intersection, or they're speeding towards it, or maybe are just interested in it. But we want to meet people there, and then the tech side of things, which is so fascinating today. Every week there's something almost mind-blowing that is happening, whether we are aware of it or not. Like we're getting the little bits and pieces, but the people who are at the forefront of these learning machines and these algorithms and the technology are just making groundbreaking, like earth-shattering stuff, to where even like we talked about last podcast, the government's like, hey, you're not allowed to release that because that's basically just a big old weapon waiting to happen. And we're just all here in our innocent little bubbles going like, oh, cool. Yeah, this is fun. Hey, chat, tell me this, But so the tech thing is something we definitely are interested in. And in faith, obviously. And I love the thing that happened with you, Anthony. You're like, my work life, my tech life, all of this was really kind of stirring up, ramping up. So I started going to seminary. It was just like, I need some help. I need some philosophy for this. I need some like understanding. I need something that's rooted way beyond, just on human capacity or this modern era. And so I think that's what's fun, is like we're kind of trying to bring those three worlds together. And I said this in the sermon on Sunday, but I was at another church. They asked me to come be on a panel, and I ended up being the only one on the panel, which was like, okay, panel of one. And they were interviewing me, and the whole topic was all about politics and power and kind of how Christianity interacts with all of those things, and maybe forms our thinking on those things. But at the very end, completely out of nowhere, he said, well, could you also just tell us anything like the Lord's speaking to you about AI? And it was just so funny because it's like, doesn't matter the topic, it's like there has to be also, hey, could you tell us about how AI is affecting this, or what are your thoughts on it? Because it's just so interesting. And I spent last week, I was in Belize, Central America, and literally in a village of about 350 people. And I lived there. I've been there many times. Brandon actually spent a summer there one time as an intern. And I mean, there's just not much going on. Like it's got very little industry. I mean, no industry. I mean, they have running water most of the time. They have power most of the time. But it's so remote and off the beaten path. Yet they got Wi-Fi. They all have cell phones somehow. I mean, there's like very little money in the village, but all the kids, everybody's got a cell phone. And then I was talking with one of the pastor there, and he was saying, I was like, what about ChatGPT? Is anybody using that type of stuff? Or like, and he's like, oh, you got to be kidding me. The kids don't even do homework anymore. They're all just on ChatGPT getting their own. So it was just like, you've got to be kidding me that here in this village in the middle of nowhere, like the kids are onto it, like they're already saying, hey, this thing could do work for me. Bam, this is awesome. And they're wondering, and the teachers are saying, this is not so awesome, So there's kind of even like a generational crash, which there's always between teachers and students. There'll always be a difference of opinions, I think. But again, just how pervasive, how important this topic is. It's coming up everywhere. So, Anthony, you're kind of our go-to on the cutting edge of all of this stuff. So I know that this week you were doing some other things and maybe not trying to pay attention so much, but anything come up this week or whatever on the tech side of things that's interesting?
Yeah,
we'll do our segment called What the Heck Tech.
We need a beautiful like video bumper there or something, right? Or theme song or jingle. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What came up this week, I think this was news from a few weeks prior, but Pat Gelsinger, who I think some folks might know, he's the former CEO of Intel and VMware. but beyond that, a outspoken Christian, a philanthropist, a believer, who has done so much for certainly the faith community in the Bay Area. And I think we can kind of talk more about that. He released an article that kind of revealed that a sort of meeting happened at Anthropic, which is one of the big kind of foundational labs, who's building kind of the core kind of frontier kind of AI, that brought together Christian leaders or faith leaders across different traditions. I believe even some like secular ethicists were brought in. And this was intentional from the team at Anthropic to kind of create discussion around how these tools are being created, how they're being formed, to use the language that Pat used in the article. And so he put this together and used a lot of language in talking about how Claude is actually developed, like words like covenant, formation, a lot of like theological concepts into how this series of code effectively that's being built, how the decisions are being kind of guided. And so I sent this over to David to get your read. And I know you had a chance to review it. I was curious from the pastoral kind of context, what do you make of the formation of AI and what that means for our own formation as humans?
Yeah. I actually love, at the conclusion of the article, one of the questions that they posed was if AI character is being formed, so literally this intelligence, that's supposed to serve humanity and promote human flourishing, if that technology is being formed, then how important it is for Christians to be at the forefront of that and helping create this tool in a way that's going to form humanity more into the likeness and image of Christ, than less. And I think that's a great question. But then also, like, he's saying basically, if we're going to try and form it, and it's going to be influential, on our kids, on ourselves, on everything we do, how important it is for us to be engaged. I mean,
totally.
And again, I don't know if there's tons of answers here. I think what they were trying to do in this article was to help people think not all of these AI, scientists or developers or engineers are evil, horrible people trying to ruin humanity, but instead, see them as people that we should love and care for and reach out to and see if we can have a seat at the table. Not to be the loudest voice or controlling it all, but basically, I love what Bonhoeffer always said, that the church should be the conscience of the state. And I think the church has a role in all kinds of fascinating, or all kinds of facets of society, to be a conscience of some sort, to just be a voice that is saying, hey, there's probably a better way, or hey, what if we took the little bit harder path maybe, so that it doesn't cause damage to our kids, or so it doesn't create the kind of hostility that a lot of the social media stuff has. Like, what can we do to stand against those? So yeah, I thought it's cool, and Pat Gesslinger I think is a good name for us to put out on this podcast, where if you're interested in how these things together, this guy is probably one of the leaders in this intersection of work, tech, and faith. He's ahead of the game, I think, for most people. And so far, it seems like what he's doing and what they're promoting seems to be really wonderful stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, and they actually sum up with 3 things that basically said, if you're a pastor, you need to be talking about this in your sermons. If you lead a ministry, find one Christian thinker working on AI and read their work this week. And I think when he says if you lead a ministry, you might think, oh, like official capacity, but this is if you lead a home group, if you have a family, like if you have friends, if you are doing any kind of ministry at all, and which is all Christians. You should probably find someone that can be a bit of a luminary for you in this path. And hopefully this podcast can do some of that, but there's better people than us too. So we'll try and keep introducing you to them as well. And then the last thing was, if you're a thoughtful Christian, the third one, he said, just sit with these questions for an hour and just kind of pray. And I loved when I was at that Fixate church, what the pastor asked at the end was, he said, he said, do you have any insight or wisdom for the church, or for how we can navigate the AI age? But he used the word prophecy, and he said, do you have any prophetic insight? And again, depending on your tradition, you can feel a lot of different feelings about that word. But I know that God speaks to his people, and there are a lot of times in biblical the biblical story within church history where there were very disorienting or very extremely challenging things, and the people of God would rely on that reality of a prophet or someone who could speak something that maybe didn't totally fit the reality of what was going on. It wasn't a conclusion that everyone would come to on their own, but there was something spoken from outside, which is the Bible as a whole, but something spoken for that moment. And so I mean, the pastor Micah there at Fixate, I just thought it was cool that he was saying, hey, not just, hey, tell us what you've learned, but also, is there something that you've heard from God, or from revelation that could be helpful in this? And I think it'd be good for Christians to all do that a bit. Say, okay, Lord, what are you saying? And maybe the Lord's just saying, don't worry, I got you. And like some of the sermons that we've been preaching. But maybe there's something else too, or maybe the Lord has a calling for you. Like Anthony, you've slowly kind of stumbled into saying, hey, maybe this isn't just something that like I'm going through, but maybe the Lord's taken me through this so that I could offer something to others who might be going through this as well. So yeah, I think it was a good article, good works going on over there. We can put the article in the link to the YouTube or whatever if you want to check that out. We got to get the chore app in there too. We promised everybody that.
Oh, that's right. I will do that. You'll see all the compliance or non-compliance my children have had on their chores and doing it.
Yeah, going to expose your children.
Yeah, it's accountability, right? It's community-driven accountability.
All right, so now I want to introduce Brandon Gurney a little bit more, and we get to hear from him some. This is Brandon. He's a friend of mine. I met him at Living Streams Church in Phoenix when he was going to Grand Canyon University. He actually was an intern here for a while, and lived in my house for a month or so, or something like that. He's got the same birthday as one of my daughters.
That's right.
Yep. And Brandon's a really good guy, and he is not just interested in this. He is a thoughtful Christian, but he's also working in a field that really touches on a number of these things. So he's a thoughtful Christian. He's interested in this type of stuff and always has been, but he's also in a job that touches on these things. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about those things, a little bit about you, and then the work that you're doing, and how it's kind of even pushed you further into this intersection.
Yeah, certainly, I'd be happy to. I mean, as you said, David, I was deeply involved with Living Streams for a number of years, and had the opportunity while I was on the team there to really kind of dig in early before the pandemic on this concept of kind of digital or hybrid ministry. And that was one of the things that you tasked me with, I think in 2018, 2019, was kind of sussing out, okay, what does ministry look like in an increasingly digital world? At the time, talking about an online campus for Living Streams and trying to reach, the 1,000 or so folks that were streaming our services on a weekend with something more meaningful than just content, but ultimately trying to engage them with community in some form or facet. And so spent about a year trying to figure that dynamic out. And then the pandemic happened, and every single church in America was thrown into the same question of how do we engage with people in an increasingly digital first reality? And many, many twists and turns over the early pandemic years, as I'm sure many of our listeners probably have stories where it's like, okay, in my life, and then COVID, right? And I had a little bit of one of those moments, as you know, where I was planning on spending some time in the developing world in Ecuador in 2020 and 2021. That ultimately ended up turning into a year in Southern California, dealing with the pandemic in a ministry context rather than in a developing world context. And that's really where I started seeing more of the fruit of this digital first world coming into play in lockdown in California. And I remember, David, talking to you several times on the phone during COVID. And I'm like, man, it would be wild to just be back to relatively business as usual in May or June of 2020. And in California, I know that Anthony, you were there at that time as well. It was very much digital only was the way that people were engaging with one another. And so really that was kind of a proving ground for me in a lot of ways of trying to figure out, okay, how do we as ministry leaders still engage with a local church context in a world where you got access to unlimited information. And of course, we've seen that going exponential with AI. But at the time, it's like I can tune into any church in the entire world digitally. So what makes engaging with my local church in the Central Coast of California different? And is there actually something profoundly discipleship oriented with me being connected with somebody that I have a physical relationship with, rather than just me streaming whatever service happens to be online that's the most compelling? And so that was kind of the beginning of my journey with the company that I'm a part of now. But I had the opportunity in 2021 to join the team at a company that really kind of walks at that intersection of faith and technology. And that's where I'm at now.
Yeah. So Brandon, what I'm hearing you say is basically you are trying to wrestle with this idea where, can digital connection and community be something that is valid for formation, or is it a counterfeit to the in-person, and we need to watch out for that, or is there some legitimacy to it and actually can be functional and useful, even if it doesn't replace in-person and face-to-face. And so that's where you were really trying to get to the bottom of that, which is so like where we're headed. I mean, in ways that we never could have imagined back then, both because of the reality of how comfortable people are now just being online because of COVID and that season, but also because of the new technologies.
Totally. Yep. And I think the point that I'm seeing, or at least what I was seeing in 2021, 2022, is that people are increasingly technologically engaged and are also simultaneously becoming more disengaged from in-person relationships. And yet at the same time, they're looking to digital tools as kind of the catalyst almost back into those relationships, as weird as that might sound. So an example of this is, COVID requires separation. Therefore, I'm not connected with, even just in this room, like we're doing this over video podcast, we're not in the same state with one another. And yet we're using the technology as a means to still find some semblance of human connection. Of course, this would be a lot better if we could all sit down at the same table in Phoenix, Arizona. I think that we'd probably enjoy sharing a cup of coffee together. And that's ultimately going to be the goal. But there is something redemptive about the fact that we can still use technology as a way to build some form of connection. Not that it's meant to be a replacement of, but that it's meant to be kind of a supplement.
There's a role for it. And I think, to completely discount it and or be afraid of it or whatever is not going to be helpful for anyone going forward in any aspect of life. But
Absolutely.
We do have to watch out for how it replaces, or like, what is it? If it becomes more convenient isn't always better, isn't always creating the depth or the richness. And yet, like you said, you had mentioned, it's fascinating that we can listen to the greatest teachers of all time, for the most part, and definitely of our time, face to face to some extent on a screen. It's fascinating, the resource. I actually was listening to something this week, and they were talking about some of the advancements in the language models of AI, and they're saying I mean, within the next 10 years, they don't know exactly what obstacles will be there, but they can't imagine us not being able to translate the Bible in every single language. I
Right.
mean, that's just awesome. That's fascinating. And that's creating connection with the scriptures. That's creating connection with God to
Mhm.
some extent. And that's bringing the world together in a really unique and powerful way. So there's so much opportunity there, but at the same time, like what have you found, like, it can't replace? Like, have you
Mhm.
concluded people can just have their discipleship online, no problem, or is there an in-person reality, and what makes the in-person more significant?
Totally. And I think we felt the impacts of this in California probably more than anywhere, was the years of increasing disconnection and really the impact on the human soul of not being in physical relationship with one another in a meaningful way. And my job now, I kind of live in the intersection of faith and technology, working for a company that primarily serves the nonprofit and church space. And so I made that transition kind of out of vocational ministry into ministry adjacent corporate world in the end of 2021. And now that's what I do for a living, is I talk to churches around the country, primarily the larger churches on the West Coast. So I spent a lot of time in San Jose, working with church leaders there. Spent a lot of time in Los Angeles and obviously in Phoenix, and get the opportunity of talking with church leaders about, okay, well, how has this changed the way that you think about discipleship within your community? Is it that we had this little blip on the radar called COVID, and now we go back to business as usual? Or has this actually changed fundamentally the way that we think about the role that technology plays in how we're going to engage with people moving forward? And the churches that I see in 2026 that are the most successful at kind of bridging that gap have adopted what I call kind of like a hybrid ministry model, which is, we did a sermon series, of course, David, almost 10 years ago, called The Other Hours, right? Where we got into this concept that, God wants you to be good at life, not good at church. And we spend probably 2 hours a week max. In fact, if you look at the Barna stats, usually for most Christians in America, it's more like visiting church once a month is more the norm than once a week now. So more like, half an hour a week is kind of the average. You got 168 hours in a week, maybe 167 of those people are spending outside church. But at least as the token zillennial on this call, my generation is spending, 5, 6, 7 hours a day using this device, right? For work, outside of that, as well as the primary connection point with the outside world. I work remote, and all of my coworkers are in different states. So my reality 8 hours a day is on this device that I'm using right now, connecting with people in the outside world. So it has become a source of connection, but at the same time, it's never going to replace what I have with my in-person physical community. And I feel like it's actually enhanced that, where I have a greater value now for the relationships I can have with people in person, because it actually is something that's a little bit more rare. And I do think, getting back to your question, David, that'll never be replaced. The question is, how do church leaders use this tool and others as a resource to actually perpetuate connection throughout the week in the midst of disconnection? And that can look like a variety of different things. That can look like what we're doing right now,
Yeah.
as a way to still engage with one another, even if it's not, all at the same table sharing a cup of coffee, which would be my preference in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Anthony, on that same note. As far as the business sector as well, I mean, it's the same thing to some extent, because you know if you can spend time in person with somebody, the amount of like, it was funny. I had these two young guys. I'm trying to help them get some summer work done, and basically we came up with this idea of washing trash cans. So, like, everyone puts their trash cans out one day, the next day it's picked up. So there's this little window where you could say, hey, we'll come by and wash them and then take them back to your house. It's a little service, trying to make a little money. And it was these first guys really doing sales. So they're going door to door and leaving a flyer in the mailbox. So there's a bit of communication from a flyer to a mailbox. I had ChatGPT make the flyer, by the way, and it was awesome. But but that versus if they can actually talk to someone at the door, and these people can see these two young guys who are trying to make some money for college, like the pull for them to be like, yeah, man, you could clean my trash can for $25 or whatever. Like the different, like in marketing, you guys studied this, you perfected this to
Yeah.
where it's like, if somebody sees something one time, if somebody sees something 27 times, if somebody
Yeah.
sees a flyer versus if somebody has a conversation. And so tell us a little bit about the power of that, like in-person connection versus those other things, even though those other things can be valuable.
Yeah. Oh gosh, so much to say. Maybe just on practically, yes, the digital touch points, matter. There's like air cover and all the stats are true. I forgot the one you just referenced around. You have to see something several times in order to like form the decision to buy it. But I think what we're also reacting to a little bit as consumers of things like that we might be marketed, that might marketed to us, is we're sort of tired of all this sort of like transactional ads and the things that are just trying to get us to pull the wallet out and buy the thing, or even easier now with like an Apple Pay, right? And so the bigger trend that I'm seeing is more of this move from transactions to relationship driven marketing or sales or whatever the case is. And it's the same. It's what you're referencing with this idea of the kind of, cleaning business on the trash cans. It's like, we need a way to communicate who we are, what we stand for. And oftentimes, in many of those cases, people buy into what you or why you do things more than what you do. It's the whole Simon Sinek kind of golden circle thing, which is a great YouTube video if folks haven't seen it.
Yeah.
And so my belief on the marketing side is, well, that's a really cool opportunity for us to be almost not necessarily step away completely from transactional marketing, although I do think there's a AI driven future for a lot of that body of work, and focus more on telling stories and being authentic and having kind of conversations like this one where you can talk about the why a little bit more. You can introduce yourself, who you are, what you stand for, maybe be a little vulnerable or authentic. And that fits into the research that shows people buy products and services emotionally, and then they justify that purchase functionally or through some type of rational bit. So I'd say that's all very true. I will say also that, Brandon, your background is just bringing up a lot of memories from, I worked at a company that was in the virtual event space during the pandemic. And let's just say it went really well, and then very quickly, not so much. And I think that example, and I'm referring specifically to like event organizers in the tech space, so very different kind of use case, but it spoke to just humanity's desire to be in person, to be with each other, to build relationship and get back to that kind of core very human need that we have. And so I think it's no surprise that we're seeing, even as a reaction to the AI kind of transformation and everything that's happening, there's a lot of dialogue around 2026 is the year of analog, or the year of in person or offline, or these types of words. And I don't think that's kind of become the kind of primary kind of lever yet, but I do think it just speaks to this whole thing, right? It speaks to our desire to be with each other in community, in person. And candidly, as a marketer, at least, it gives me some hope for the profession, because I'd feel good about going to work every day, helping cultivate relationships. And so I'm quite optimistic about that.
Brandon, I thought it was so interesting when you said that basically you're describing your situation where your work life is literally spread out all over the country and maybe even the world, or is it all US based?
It's all over the world. I mean, I'm targeted on the West Coast, but I had I had a deal that I was working with in Australia the last couple of weeks.
Okay.
And
so your work life though is so broad, but then your personal life, your home life is actually smaller than maybe you ever imagined it would be. And because I know you've always just had a lot of friends, and at GCU you kind of were connected to everybody, but like your really meaningful life connections, the one that create the most formation in your life and the most community, have actually shrunk smaller and smaller, and yet are so valuable and so meaningful. And
Mhm.
so I think that's an interesting thing. It almost makes me think back to, when people used to not have cars, used to not, have all these other things, that basically it was like you and your farm, your family, and then you'd have a little interaction with the neighbors whenever you were raising the barn or something, but basically you weren't your most important personal connections, the other hours people, was a smaller segment of society, and probably much deeper and more, more, because you're not so spread out. And even though at that point, they weren't having connections all over the world or whatever, but I don't know, it almost made me think that it's almost like there's been this kind of comeback from,
Mhm.
being out every night, going to hang out with everybody all the time, having hundreds and hundreds of friends, to now, like, they're more precious, the connections you do have, and you can get deeper in those things. And I don't know, there's something kind of beautiful about that. And I know you have, young kids, so it's like, that's another part where I remember when we first had our firstborn, for the first 6 months, she just screamed from 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. every day. So our circle got real small.
Yep.
It was basically like the three of us, my wife and her.
Mhm.
People would, hey, you want to come over? We're like, you don't want us to come over. Our kid will just scream the whole time. So that's another part of it. But yeah, I think hopefully what some of that can do is help us to hold, these things more sacred and more
Mhm.
precious, and really invest in those relationships. As long as we can, as long as, work life, online life is just that, and then we close that, and we don't go, scrolling and and like trying to have all these, those dopamine hit connections that really are not connections at all, but they feel like connections, or the parasocial or whatever dynamic
Mhm.
that's going on. The other
Well, I
thing I
think
thought of when you were talking, oh, go ahead,
no, I
respond
was
to
going to
that.
say, thinking about Anthony's point a moment ago, of just the value of the in-person connection. Like, he's a marketer, I work in sales, right? So it's kind of rare that we get on the same call together, which is kind of fun. But what I've seen, even just professionally over the last 12 months, is that people are becoming increasingly suspicious of what's coming into their inbox or the communications that they're
Mm,
receiving, because it is this question of, is this human or is this AI?
hmm.
And to Anthony's point, you know what I mean? I've found that, my job is connecting with human beings, which is almost exclusively done using technology. But what I'm finding now is that the more human that I can be, the better. Right. And I mean, just, we can get into this as much as we want to, the fears around artificial intelligence and what that means for the billion knowledge workers in the world, of which I'm one. You know what I mean? Of replacement, or whatever that might potentially look like. I think the thing that people are grappling with right now is this greater question of the entire podcast, which is, what does it mean to be human? And what do we have that an artificial intelligence is never going to? And how can we lean into that even deeper? And even, to your point, David, like, how do I lean into the relationships in my life that are the most meaningful? Because artificial intelligence is kind of showing us the other side of that, or the artificial version of connection, or the artificial version of intelligence itself, and then realizing what it means to actually be human, and then double down on those things. So, like, in my professional world, like, I do a lot of things that I are more analog than I ever have, because I have to. You know what I mean? I'll make more phone calls than I'll send emails. I'll show up at people's doorsteps more so than I used to even 3 or 4 years ago, just to prove, hey, I'm a real person out
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
It's not just something that was, sent to you via, ChatGPT or Claude or whatever. Um, and I don't see that changing. I think realistically, we do see this pendulum swing of, like, adoption, and then kind of the reaction against it. And I think it's almost like we're seeing that more and more extreme right now, where it's like, okay, where's the limit? Oh, we're going to swing back this way. And I think the truth is somewhere in between. Right? It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
these tools are tools. They can be extremely helpful. But the reality is that, like, our humanity is still an essential ingredient in all of this.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we can get really, really deep into, especially, like, what does it mean to be human in the age of AI, especially as a sales professional or a marketing professional or as a pastor. that's really the question I think all of us are probably grappling with to some degree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was talking about in the sermon yesterday for us. I don't know when people are listening to this, but the thing that just gives me so much comfort is the greatest thing in all of creation is humanity. I mean, it's just nothing is going to replace that. And I think that's where there's a little bit of a like reaction to artificial intelligence that's like, get out of here, you're no good, because the devil's always trying to counterfeit what God makes, what God does, who God is. Like there's counterfeit love, there's counterfeit peace, there's counterfeit, like hope. There's the devil's always providing, the world's always providing counterfeits to the real thing. But eventually everyone knows that's a counterfeit. Like you can get high, and feel a lot of peace or maybe a lot of joy, but everyone knows that's not real, and it's actually going to damage your humanity. And that's what happens with all the counterfeits. And I think that's where it's like with AI, there is a reality of, I could see the devil being like, yeah, let's counterfeit humanity. Let's, and even to the point where transhumanism comes in, where it's like, let's continue to, like counterfeit humanity to the point where people are now like basically, making themselves into no longer human, like they're trying to get ahead. They're desecrating the holy. They're crossing boundaries that God has given us so that they can be superhuman, right? Like the enhancement games or whatever kind of cyborg realities might be coming down the way. Again, I don't think all of the inventions and technologies will be negative or bad, but there is a point at which people will take it too far, trying to grasp, godlike character, trying to dominate others, or to, their ambitions will take them beyond what is holy, what is sacred, what is right. And that will be there, but that's just a counterfeit. And everyone's going to know it's a counterfeit eventually. Everyone's going to be like, yeah, I've watched that destroy your life. So I don't think that's even good, even though it might have given you a good buzz, or maybe you got 5 years of really cool, look at how amazing that guy is. But eventually it's going to strip you of everything that's truly valuable. So I think the comfort is just always like humanity. God is so anthrocentric, right? And we shouldn't be anthrocentric, as far as thinking man is the center or the greatest, or humans are the greatest. But for some reason, God has decided to be that way, where he's so anthrocentric, and we need to be theocentric, where God is the center of the universe. That was in the sermon on yesterday. But yeah, I think that gives me comfort. But then also we need to watch out though, because there is a counterfeit reality, and we can bite into too much of that, thinking this is a good thing or thinking this will make us wise, kind of that same thing from Genesis. But really it just, it's a desecration.
Well, the interesting thing is that we're seeing right now is there's actually a shift that's happening with the use of AI. And Anthony, you got a little bit into this last week's podcast, but the primary functions of why people are actually using a chatbot like a ChatGPT or a Claude has actually shifted away from just knowledge acquisition to companionship.
Oh yeah.
So as people are feeling more and more disconnected from tech, as a result of technology to some degree, also, political polarization, the pandemic kind of expedited kind of what was already, I think, happening in our country underneath the surface and just kind of put it in hyperdrive for a few years. People are looking for what's real and that sense of connection. And if they're not finding it in their physical relationships or in their faith community or whatever that might look like, they're actually going to AI to seek a pseudo form of companionship as a way to kind of fill that void. And so as somebody who's a pastor or somebody who's seeing that, I think that the church needs to understand that reality, that there is an enormous gap that people around the world are feeling right now, where it's like, okay, I feel more disconnected than ever. I feel more uncertain than ever. We read the headlines, for those of us who are these knowledge workers, we're like, are we all going to be replaced in 2 years or 3 weeks? And I've been feeling that anxiety, just being fully transparent. It's like, will I have is there a job for me in the future with artificial intelligence? If this thing can write better than I can and can speak better than I can, and, can be more efficient than I can be, it's a call, I think, for those who hold the truth and can actually engage with people personally, to get out there and actually be more human in the
Yeah.
midst of all of that. So I don't know. I throw that out there for the sake of conversation, but I do think that's fascinating that as quickly as artificial intelligence is being developed, the fact that people are naturally gravitating towards, oh, I don't just want information, I actually want connection, and are starting to actually use these chatbots as a way to try to glean that form of connection that they're maybe missing in their physical lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw out something a little vulnerable, but I'm curious to get your guys' read on it, just in context of this companionship thing, because I don't know if I would necessarily deem this companionship, but kind of a weird use of AI that I've found myself doing. And I've shared on the podcast, like definitely health anxiety is like a big thing I struggle with. And, over time I've fed like, blood test results and all these sorts of things in, which is actually like a really compelling use case because I can look at data across different things over time, and that could help just be proactive about health more generally.
Yeah.
But the struggle, the shadow side from an anxiety perspective, at least in my story, is I tend to ruminate on things, and I'm like almost like an OCD type of a way of like, oh gosh, I have a, I'm making whatever it is, like maybe I'm dying, like let me Google this, right? And so it used to be the Google, the web Dr. Google or whatever, I think was the phrasing for people like me. And now it's ChatGPT, right? And so the way I've sort of used it a little bit from the health perspective, which I'm curious how you all would receive this, is almost some questions I'd be too embarrassed to ask a nurse practitioner or someone, because they're like, what's wrong with this guy? Like, stop messaging us on the My Health app, dude. Like, move on. I would ask ChatGPT. And what I've noticed is actually two different, maybe as a slight aside, reactions. ChatGPT would be like very optimistic about it and be like, great question. Like, here's what I'm seeing. Like, oh, you're probably like, no. Claude cut me off. It was like, I am not going to answer this for you. Like, you have to, this is a health anxiety thing. Like, you need to talk to a human about this. You are fine, but my telling you you're fine all the time is not going to help you kind of get to the other end.
Interesting.
And so that was a really interesting dynamic. But I'm curious because I'm definitely weird and I shouldn't be doing this. I know I'm working on it, but also like it's less companionship for me, but it is almost an enabler of a behavior that I otherwise would not have had it not been so knowledge rich, right? And having the memory of all of my data and convenient.
Yeah,
totally. So my self accountability is locking my cell phone away, to your point, David, after work. But I do feel that temptation. Maybe it's not companionship, but to man-driven assurance that I'm going to be okay versus bringing that in prayer to God and to the Holy Spirit. And so that's something I'm wrestling with, and I suspect others might as well.
Oh, I bet you there's so many people that are like, yeah. I mean, I think obviously because I've had my, back issues this year and my nerve issues. And so I was definitely saying, oh, like, what's the best position to sleep if I got this, and this, and had some good ideas. And sometimes it steered me in a helpful way. Sometimes it didn't. But no, I think that's a fascinating application because you're talking about more than just medical, because we know there's limitations to it medically for sure. But you're saying, like, I also just I'm asking it not just for medical advice, but also for a little reassurance, a little encouragement, a little like you're like all these other things. And is it feeding, is it feeding anxiety or is it just like, I mean, maybe even worse is it's just giving me a false sense of, everything's okay when maybe it's not, or things aren't okay when it is. I hear Dalton in my head a lot. Dalton works here at Living Streams, and he's over our creative arts department, and he's a what do you call it, a zillennial, or like a Gen Z millennial?
He's a little bit younger than I am, so he's, I would say, safely in the Gen Z category, but walks that line like I do. of
but he's
being
he's
mid 90s babies.
he's also got an
Mhm.
old soul in some ways. So
Yeah.
he just got himself a flip phone, because he's in full revolt. He's in full like, get your hands off me. Someone was texting like some funny photos, like AI generated photos of me and him, or him and somebody else, and he was like, please stop, because I don't really want China to have all these pictures of me. So like he's like he's got a little bit of those guardrails in his own life, and I think he's got his own server at home kind of stuff, like all that type of stuff. But I've also been, it's been interesting because he's younger, right? And he's at the cutting edge of, the digital world, and he's using all those tools, but he's also just trying to make sure that it doesn't get its hooks in him, so to
Yeah.
speak. And so he talks about digital discipline. He tried to, he's like, our church should just go on a digital sabbatical and all these type of things. I was like, it's so funny because he's really, and like, he just tries to get people to say, don't trust, like these things still make so many mistakes. So don't put too much
Yeah.
trust in them. And so it's just so funny because I almost hear like, the 65-year-olds saying all these things through Dalton's like 30-year-old body. It's
Yeah.
kind of funny, but yeah, no, I think that's a huge reality, and I do think what you're saying, Anthony, is so insightful to where, yes, we have to have self-control. We have to make sure it's not replacing. That's what Tim Keller used to always say, is that anything that gives us what God's supposed to give us is idolatry. Like, so
Right.
anytime we're looking to something for something that the Lord should give us, and really primarily, like, obviously, like my wife, I look to my wife for certain things, but as long as I'm, looking to the Lord above that, and then my wife, and then, like if I have a decisions to make, I go to the Lord first, and he has the highest place. But then I go to my wife, I go to some friends, I look, all those things. So it's not bad to do that, but it's just at what point are we trusting in it more
Yeah.
so than the Lord, or more often, and I think that's really what it comes down to. And that's the line that we're going to have to figure out, all individually, but also as a
Yeah.
church, for the world.
Well, something interesting that Anthony's bringing up too is this reality that the technology itself is not neutral, right? There's actually something behind it that is influencing us and actually forming us. And this isn't new. Like, I think that, artificial intelligence has kind of put like an entity associated with technology, and therefore we relate to it almost more human than ever before.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is these are tools that have been around for a long time. This is just kind of the culmination of that. So going back to the mid 20th century, you look at some writings, like if you're familiar with Marshall McLuhan, medium theory, that whole thing, it's like the tools themselves actually have the ability to form the way that we communicate, the way that we engage with the world, not just the information itself. And so, like, what Anthony's bringing up there is that actually what's written into Claude versus ChatGPT is actually a totally different philosophy of how information is meant to be acquired. So, like, ChatGPT, to your point, it has a tendency to almost be a little bit more sycophantic. It's like, yeah, you're great. Like, just keep going. You know what I mean? Because the ultimate goal is maximum engagement, right? So it's like, how long can I stay in this chat bot? How many tokens can I spend?
Right? And they'll give you leading questions at the end of everything. Like,
That's
I
right.
can tell you more about this if you want. And you're like, I need to know more about that. Yeah.
Why are they asking that? Like, what do they know that I don't know? Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're kidding ourselves if we're thinking that Anthropic doesn't have that bent too, but there is definitely like a level of restraint that I'm seeing on that side of things, where it's like, okay, but there needs to be a natural kind of pushback, because the reality is, like, if I'm looking to ChatGPT as a source of companionship and the source of information, and I'm almost giving up my agency in terms of, like, with a Google search, at least I can choose which article to click on. With chat, I'm not. It's choosing the article for me. So the way that I'm acquiring information has changed. So I would say my caution to people that are listening is, don't give up your agency, right, to an agent. Is take a step back and realize that these tools actually in and of themselves have formational capability. And I don't think that the answer is to run and hide from these things, but at the same time, there is an opportunity to show some restraint in the way that we engage with the tools. and say, okay, that, if I think that the example that Marshall McLuhan gave when he was writing up medium theory in the mid 20th century was, I use a tool I use a shovel to dig a hole, and the tool is forming the earth, but I may get blisters, and in a way that the tool itself is actually forming me in the process. And so I think that, applied to artificial intelligence is I'm using the tool to get information, but it's also forming the way that I'm thinking about that information and packaging it in such a way that I'm receiving it differently, whether I type that same prompt in the chat versus in Claude versus in Google, or I take that same prompt into a relationship with a friend, or I take that to the Lord. You know what I mean? And then that gets into a really interesting place where it's like, okay, well, can God speak through ChatGPT? Can God speak through Claude? And then it's, well, yeah, for sure he could. But at the same time, it's like, showing that level of restraint for us who are users, and understanding that like there's actually something that's forming me personally with just choosing to use this method in order to receive that information, to Dalton's point. You know what I mean? And it's not a neutral thing. It is actually forming us as human beings to a degree. So that's where I love what I'm seeing right now with Anthropic, the way that they are reaching out to faith leaders and saying, hey, as we build these tools, we want you to give input, because we realize that this is ultimately going to be incredibly formational for the way that humanity engages with information moving forward.
Yeah, I think some of the verses that come to mind are, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable, and then all things in moderation. I think again, there's just a self-control element. There's a there's a restraint that's required for everything. Everything is good. There's actually a verse that says, everything is good and to be received if it's received with the word of God, if it's sanctified by the word of God in prayer. And so I think, Paul, again, whatever he was dealing with in his writings with the people saying, is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? Basically, he was saying, you need to stop freaking out about everything. Everything's fine as long as it's sanctified by the word of God in prayer. And so I think even this, it's just like, okay, yeah, this tool can be a wonderful, helpful thing as long as we have some self-control. We realize there needs to be moderation, and it's sanctified by the word of God in prayer. It's not replacing our relationship with the Lord, or it's not steering us out. But as long as we're, prayed up, as long as we're solid on the word of God, this is going to be a wonderful little journey that we're going to go on in this thing. And I love Paul's perspective on that, and I think that's a good way to look at all of these things. But do to tread lightly, I also think of the story when David was bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. Every 6 steps, he would stop. He would, provide sacrifice, worship the Lord, get on his knees, and then he would stand up and take another 6 steps. And then he would get on his knees. They would make a sacrifice. He would just realize, like, this is something so precious and sacred and bigger than me that I need to just go real slow. And I say that oftentimes here at Living Streams too, as we're trying to go forward and make decisions, be like, hey, every 6 steps, we need to also just pause and thank the Lord and kind of get, because we're so quick to veer off. Our alignment is so bad often. So we just need to go slow with this thing, but go forward. I mean, I don't see any reason not to go forward. But and some of the stuff you guys are saying has been really helpful. So what's some of the stuff that your company does provide right now, Brandon? I thought people might be interested in that. Like, what's some of the tools that you guys do offer to churches and ministries? But also, is there anything like that you're excited that's coming down the pike? It's going to be so cool, kind of like the new Switchfoot album that just came out. Sorry, I had to drop that in there.
Hey, you have to, right? So, haven't had a chance to listen to it yet. But definitely will. You can get me in trouble asking a question like that, because I'm privy to some information that's not entirely public yet. But I'll give a little bit of the backstory. Like, the company I work for was founded in the early 2000s in Seattle, right across the street from Microsoft's headquarters. And so our founder was actually working in that space and kind of that tech bubble, Seattle, San Francisco, kind of being kind of the main hubs here in the U.S. for tech innovation, at least over the last 20 years, and saw the advent of this device coming down the pipeline and said, the church needs to be engaged in that space. If we're going from a desktop to remote, mobile first reality of how people access information, to a lesser degree than to AI, but at the same time pretty revolutionary. When all of a sudden people started being able to walk around with a supercomputer in their pocket, and so at the time, founder of Subsplash, which is the company I work for, Tim Turner, he reached out to his leadership team in Seattle at the church he was a part of and said, "Hey, we have this device going to be coming out called the iPhone, and there's going to be this app store that's associated with it, and I think that's going to be where people are accessing information more so than on websites anymore. And so we basically want to build a mobile app for the local church as a place that really people are accessing information and content as a primary vehicle." And so, Tim released the first ever church app in 2000, end of 2008, beginning of 2009, with the release of iPhone 1. And that kind of jump started what we were doing. And so a lot of people are familiar with Subsplash. Think of us as an app company. The truth is really Subsplash is an innovation company. So really the goal is to be on the cutting edge of technology for the sake of the church, ultimately for the sake of driving the discipleship and engagement process towards what you're talking about, David, which is primarily the end goal being physical engagement. But the reality that people are spending 167 hours a week outside of physical church experience, and those hours can be redemptive. So even getting into like what I'm talking about with the mediums themselves, like YouTube is not neutral. Google is not a neutral place. These tools have the ability to kind of form the way that we access information and the way that we perceive the world. And my company, Subsplash, what we try to do is provide technology that, even though what we build is not neutral either, it's got a natural bent towards making sure that the tech is actually helping facilitate meaningful engagement in gospel-centered content first, and done so in a more distraction-free environment. So like a very practical example is I stream a live stream from a local church. I can do that on YouTube. That's great. Probably helps with, monetization or clicks or whatever. But there's this little sidebar of suggested content that's happening that people have a tendency to be like, "Ooh, this is interesting, Pastor David, but what this other thing that Google
What, the world's going to end?"
So how do we remove that? For the sake of formation, and say, okay, instead of me clicking into those other things, I'm watching this sermon and here's the passage of scripture that goes along with it. Getting into what I'm excited about is how AI actually plays a role in the way that we access gospel-centered content, and trying to be involved in that process of helping these LLMs, these learning models, be able to surface the right type of content for the sake of formation. And so, really, really interesting example of this is I was talking to a pastor in the Bay Area a few weeks ago, and what he was telling the story of basically there was a lady who had moved to the U.S. from India. She works at one of the major tech companies in the Bay Area, and she was experiencing what she called these spiritual questions. She felt far from the gods, her words, not mine. And so she went to ChatGPT and said, here are my spiritual questions. Help me with these. And she ended up actually getting referred over from ChatGPT, a local church just down the road from her, where the pastor of that church had actually spoken about the topic that she was asking about. And then she ended up going to that church on a Sunday morning, had an encounter with the Lord. I can actually link the story to this. It's from a pastor in the Bay Area that's a friend of mine. But that seems like that kind of like was God just sort of using the tool as a way to get her connected with a physical in-person engagement where she had the opportunity to encounter the Holy Spirit and ultimately, receive salvation. And so what my company right now, what we're doing is, okay, that God was involved in that for sure. How do we actually use some of that people searching as a method to land people with the right gospel-centered content to ultimately, act upon? So instead of just by happenstance, she ends up at a Christian church down the street from her where ChatGPT doesn't care. They could have served up something very different. How do we actually get into influencing the AEO and things like that to ultimately be able to result in people finding truth? And as Christians in the tech space, how do we ultimately use these tools as vehicles to try to help people encounter Jesus in a meaningful way? So.
Totally. Well, that's good stuff, guys. Thanks so much for joining in, and looking forward to next week. We'll dive into some of these new stuff and see what's still coming down the pike. But yeah, thanks, Brandon, also for the time. Hope you have a good time this summer up in Idaho, and the winter's not too bad for you.
That's right.
But from Michigan, so you can handle it.
Sure.
But yeah, and we thank you for tuning in to listen to this. Hopefully that you found some things here and there that were helpful for your journey, where you're at, what's going on. If you could like or share, those type of things, they do help get the word out to other people. And if you have comments or anything, leave that in the comment section, or you can send an email to Living Streams Church, and we'll get that. And if you have questions you want us to touch on in this podcast, we're happy to do that as well. And we will try and get some of those things we mentioned into the comment section, or so you can link to that. But yeah, thanks again, guys, and God bless everyone, and we'll see you next time.